Section 14 of Once a Week by A. Milne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Merely Players, Part 2. One of Our Sufferers. There is no question before the country of more importance than that of national health. In my own small way, I have made something of a study of it, and when a Royal Commission begins its enquiries, I shall put before it the evidence which I have accumulated. I shall lay particular stress upon the health of Thomson. "You'll beat me to-day," he said, as he swung his club stiffly on the first tee. "I shan't be able to hit a ball." "You should have some lessons," I suggested. Thomson gave a snort of indignation. "It's not that," he said, "but I've been very seedy lately, and that's all right, I shan't mind. I haven't played a thoroughly well man for a month now. You know, I think my liver—" I held up my hand. "Not before the caddie, please," I said severely. "He is quite a child." Thomson said no more for the moment, but hit his ball hard and straight along the ground. "It's perfectly absurd," he said with a shrug. "I shan't be able to give you a game at all. Well, if you don't mind playing a sick man—" "Not if you don't mind being one," I replied, and drove a ball which also went along the ground, but not so far as my opponent's. "There, I'm about the only man in England who can do that when he's quite well." The ball was sitting up nicely for my second shot, and I managed to put it on the green. Thomson's, 50 yards farther on, was reclining in the worst part of a bunker which he had forgotten about. "Well, really," he said, "there's an example of luck for you. Your ball—" "I didn't do it on purpose," I pleaded. "Don't be angry with me." He made 2 attempts to get out, and then picked his ball up. We walked in silence to the second tee. "This time," I said, "I shall hit the sphere properly," and with a terrific swing I stroked it gently into a gorse bush. I looked at the thing in disgust, and then felt my pulse. Apparently I was still quite well. Thomson, forgetting about his liver, drove a beauty. We met on the green. "5," I said. "Only 5?" asked Thomson suspiciously. "6," I said, holing a very long putt. Thomson's health had a relapse. He took 4 short putts, and was down in 7. "It's really rather absurd," he said, in a conversational way, as we went to the next tee, "that putting should be so ridiculously important. Take that hole, for instance. I get on the green in a perfect 3. You fluff your drive completely and get on it. What was it?" "5," I said again. 5. And yet you win the hole. It is rather absurd, isn't it?" "I've often thought so," I admitted readily. "That is to say, when I've taken 4 putts. I'm 2 up." On the third tee, Thomson's health became positively alarming. He missed the ball altogether. "It's ridiculous to try to play," he said with a forced laugh. "I can't see the ball at all." "It's still there," I assured him. He struck at it again, and it hurried off into a ditch. "Look here," he said, "wouldn't you rather play the pro? This is not much of a match for you." I considered. Of course, a game with the pro would be much pleasanter than a game with Thomson, but ought I to leave him in his present serious condition of health? His illness was approaching its critical stage, and it was my duty to pull him through if I could. "No, no," I said. "Let's go on. The fresh air will do you good." "Perhaps it will," he said hopefully. "I'm sorry I'm like this, but I've had a cold hanging about for some days, and that, on top of my liver—" "Quite so," I said. The climax was reached at the next hole when, with several strokes in hand, he topped his approach shot into a bunker. For my sake, he tried to look as though he had meant to run it up along the ground, having forgotten about the intervening hazard. It was a brave effort to hide from me the real state of his health, but he soon saw that it was hopeless. He sighed and pressed his hand to his eyes. Then he held his fingers a foot away from him and looked at them as if he were trying to count them correctly. His state was pitiable, and I felt that at any cost I must save him. I did. The corner was turned at the fifth, where I took 4 putts. "You aren't going to win all the holes," he said grudgingly as he ran down his putt. Convalescence set in at the 6th, when I got into an impossible place and picked up. "Oh, well, I shall give you a game yet," he said. 2 down. The need for further bulletins ceased at the 7th hole, which he played really well and won easily. "Aha! You won't beat me by much," he said, "in spite of my liver." "By the way, how is the liver?" I asked. "Your fresh air cure is doing it good. Of course, it may come on again, but—" He drove a screamer. "I think I shall be all right," he announced. "All square," he said cheerily at the 9th. "I fancy I'm going to beat you now. Not bad, you know, considering you were 4 up. Practically speaking, I gave you a start of 4 holes." I decided that it was time to make an effort again, seeing that Thompson's health was now thoroughly re-established. On the next 7 holes I managed to win 3 and have 2. It is only fair to say, though, as Thompson did several times, that I had an extraordinary amount of good luck, and that he was dogged by ill fortune throughout. But this, after all, is as nothing, so long as one's health is above suspicion. The great thing was that Thompson's liver suffered no relapse, even though, at the 17th tee, he was 1 down and 2 to play. And it was on the 17th tee that I had to think seriously how I wanted the match to end. Thompson, at lunch, when he has won, is a very different man from Thompson, at lunch, when he has lost. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that I was in rather a happy position. If I won, I won, which was jolly. If I lost, Thompson won, and we should have a pleasant lunch. However, as it happened, the match was halved. "Yes, I was afraid so," said Thompson. "I let you get too long a start. It's absurd to suppose that I can give you 4 holes up and beat you. It practically amounts to giving you 4 bisques. 4 bisques is about 6 strokes. I'm not really 6 strokes better than you." "What about lunch?" I suggested. "Good. And you can have your revenge afterwards." He led the way into the pavilion. "Now, I wonder," he said, "what I can safely eat. I want to be able to give you some sort of a game this afternoon." Well, if there is ever a royal commission upon the national physique, I shall insist on giving evidence. For it seems to me that golf, far from improving the health of the country, is actually undermining it. Thompson, at any rate, since he has taken to the game, has never been quite fit. In the swim. "Do you tango?" asked Miss Hopkins, as soon as we were comfortably seated. I know her name was Hopkins, because I had her down on my programme as Popkins, which seemed too good to be true, and in order to give her a chance of reconsidering it, I had asked her if she was one of the Popkinses of Hampshire. It had then turned out that she was really one of the Hopkinses of Maida Vale. "No," I said, "I don't." She was only the 5th person who had asked me, But then she was only my fifth partner. "Oh, you ought to. You must be up to date, you know." "I'm always a bit late with these things," I explained. "The waltz came to England in 1812, but I didn't really master it till 1904." "I'm afraid if you wait as long as that before you master the tango, it will be out." That's what I thought. By the time I learnt the tango, the bingo would be in. My idea was to learn the bingo in advance, so as to be ready for it. Think how you'll all envy me in 1917. Think how society will flock to my bingo quick lunches. I shall be the only man in London who bingos properly. Of course, by 1918 you'll all be at it." "Then we must have one together in 1918," smiled Miss Hopkins. "In 1918," I pointed out coldly, "I shall be learning the pongo." My next partner had no name that I could discover, but a fund of conversation. "Do you tango?" she asked me as soon as we were comfortably seated. "No," I said, "I don't. But," I added, "I once learned the minuet." "Oh, they're not very much alike, are they?" "Not a bit. However, luckily that doesn't matter, because I've forgotten all the steps now." She seemed a little puzzled, and decided to change the subject. "Are you going to learn the tango?" she asked. "I don't think so. It took me 4 months to learn the minuet." "But they're quite different, aren't they?" "Quite," I agreed. And she seemed to have exhausted herself for the moment. It was obviously my business to say something. There was only one thing to say. "Do you tango?" "No," she said, "I don't." "Are you going to learn?" "Oh, yes." "Ah," I said. And 5 minutes later we parted for ever. The next dance really was a tango, and I saw, to my horror, that I had a name down for it. With some difficulty I found the owner of it, and prepared to explain to her that, unfortunately, I couldn't dance the tango, but that for profound conversation about it I was undoubtedly the man. Luckily, she explained first. "I'm afraid I can't do this," she apologised. "I'm so sorry." "Not at all," I said magnanimously. "We'll sit it out." We found a comfortable seat. "Do you tango?" she asked. I was tired of saying no. "Yes," I said. "Are you sure you wouldn't like to find somebody else to do it with?" "Quite, thanks. The fact is, I do it rather differently from the way they're doing it here to night. You see, I actually learnt it in the Argentine." She was very much interested to hear this. "Really? Are you out there much? I've got an uncle living there now. I wonder if When I say I learnt it in the Argentine," I explained, "I mean that I was actually taught it in St. John's Wood, but that my dancing mistress came from—" "In St. John's Wood?" she said eagerly. "But how funny! My sister is learning there. I wonder if—" She was a very difficult person to talk to. Her relations seemed to spread themselves all over the place. "Perhaps that is hardly doing justice to the situation," I explained again. "It would be more accurate to put it like this. When I decided— By the way, does your family frequent Paris? No? Good. Well, when I decided to learn the tango, the fact that my friends, the Hopkinses of St. John's Wood, or rather Maida Vale, had already learnt it in Paris, naturally led me to— I say, what about an ice? It's getting awfully hot in here." "Oh, I don't think—" "I'll go and get them," I said hastily. And I went, and took a long time getting them. And, as it turned out that she didn't want hers, after all, a long time eating them. When I was ready for conversation again, the next dance was beginning. With a bow, I relinquished her to another. "Come along," said a bright voice behind me, This is ours. Hello, Nora, is that you? Come on. We hurried in, danced in silence, and then found ourselves a comfortable seat. For a moment neither of us spoke. Have you learnt the tango yet? Asked Nora. 14, I said aloud. Help! Does that mean that I'm the 14th person who has asked you? The night is yet young, Nora. You are only the 8th, but I was betting that you'd ask me before I counted 20. You lost, and you owe me a pair of ivory-backed hair-brushes and a cigar-cutter. Bother! Anyhow, I'm not going to be stopped talking about the tango if I want to. Did you know I was learning? I can do the scissors. Good. We'll do the new Fleet Street movement together, the scissors and paste. You go into the ballroom and do the scissors, and I'll stick here and do the paste. Can't you really do any of it at all? And aren't you going to learn? I can't, Nora. I am not going to learn, Nora. It isn't so very difficult, you know. I'd teach you myself for twopence. Will you stop talking about it for threepence? I asked, and took out 3 coppers. No. I sighed, and put them back again. It was the last dance of the evening. My hostess, finding me lonely, had dragged me up to somebody, and I, and whatever her name was, were in the supper-room drinking our farewell soup. So far we had said nothing to each other. I waited anxiously for her to begin. Suddenly she began. Have you thought about Christmas presents yet? She asked. I nearly swooned. With difficulty I remained in an upright position. She was the first person who had not begun by asking me if I danced the tango. Excuse me, I said. I'm afraid I didn't. Would you tell me your name again? I felt that it ought to be celebrated in some way. I had some notion of writing a sonnet to her. Hopkins, she said. I knew you'd forget me. Of course I haven't, I said, suddenly remembering her. The sonnet would never be written now. We had a dance together before. Yes, she said. Let me see, she added. I did ask you if you danced the tango, didn't I? End of section 14. Section 15 of Once a Week by A. Milne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, The Men Who Succeed, Part 1. The Heir. Mr. Trevor Pilkington, of the well-known firm of Trevor Pilkington, fixed his horn spectacles carefully upon his nose, took a pinch of snuff, sneezed twice, gave his papers a preliminary rustle, looked slowly round the crowded room, and began to read the will. Through 40 years of will-reading, his method of procedure had always been the same. But Jack Summers, who was sharing an ottoman with 2 of the outdoor servants, thought that Mr. Pilkington's mannerisms were designed specially to annoy him, and he could scarcely control his impatience. Yet no one ever had less to hope from the reading of a will than Jack. For the first 20 years of his life, his parents had brought him up to believe that his cousin Cecil was the heir to his Uncle Alfred's enormous fortune. And for the subsequent 10 years, his cousin Cecil had brought his Uncle Alfred up in the same belief. Indeed, Cecil had even roughed out 1 or 2 wills for signature, and had offered to help his uncle, who, however, preferred to do these things by himself, to hold the pen. Jack could not help feeling glad that his cousin was not there to parade his approaching triumph. A nasty cold, caught a week previously in attending his uncle, having kept Cecil in bed. To the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, 10 shillings and sixpence. The words came to him in a meaningless drone. To the Fresh Air Fund, 10 shillings and sixpence. To the King Edward Hospital Fund, 10 shillings and sixpence. Was all the money going into charities? To my nephew Cecil Linley, who has taken such care of me. Mr. Pilkington hesitated. 4 shillings and ninepence. To my nephew John Somers, whom, thank heaven, I have never seen, £5,000,000. A long whistle of astonishment came from the ottoman. The solicitor looked up with a frown. "It's the surprise," apologized Jack. "I hardly expected so much. I thought that the brute I thought that my cousin Cecil had nobbled, that is to say, was getting it all." "The late Mr. Alfred made 3 wills," said the lawyer in a moment of expansion. "In the first, he left his nephew Cecil a legacy of 1 shilling and tenpence. In the second, he bequeathed him a sum of 3 shillings and twopence. In the last, he set aside the amount of 4 shillings and ninepence. The evidence seems to show that your cousin was rapidly rising in his uncle's estimation. You, on the other hand, have always been a legatee to the amount of £5,000,000. But in the last will there is a trifling condition attached." He resumed his papers. "To my nephew John Somers, £5,000,000, on condition that, within 1 year from the date of my death, he marries Mary Huggins, the daughter of my dear old friend, now deceased, William Huggins." Jack Somers rose proudly from his end of the ottoman. "Thanks," he said curtly. "That tears it. It's very kind of the old gentleman, but I prefer to choose a wife for myself." He bowed to the company and strode from the room. It was a cloudless August day. In the shadow of the great elms that fringed the Sussex lane, a girl sat musing. On its side, in the grass at her feet, a bicycle, its back wheel deflated. She sat on the grassy bank with her hat in her lap, quite content to wait until the first passer-by with a repairing outfit in his pocket should offer to help her. "Can I be of any assistance?" said a manly voice, suddenly waking her from her reverie. She turned with a start. The owner of the voice was dressed in a stylish knickerbocker suit. His eyes were blue, his face was tanned, his hair was curly, and he was at least 6 foot tall. So much she noticed at a glance. "My bicycle," she said. "Punctured." In a minute he was on his knees beside the machine. A rapid examination convinced him that she had not overstated the truth, and he whipped from his pocket the repairing outfit, without which he never travelled. "I can do it in a moment," he said. "At least, if you can just help me a little." As she knelt beside him, he could not fail to be aware of her wonderful beauty. The repairs, somehow, took longer than he thought. Their heads were very close together all the time, and indeed on one occasion came violently into contact. "There," he said at last, getting up and barking his shin against the pedal. That'll be all right." "Thank you," she said tenderly. He looked at her without disguising his admiration. A tall, straight figure in the sunlight, its right shin rubbing itself vigorously against its left calf. "It's absurd," he said at last. "I feel as if I've known you for years. And anyway, I'm certain I've seen you before somewhere." "Did you ever go to the Seaside Girl?" she asked eagerly. "Often." "Do you remember the Spanish princess who came on at the beginning of the second act and said 'Wow, wow' to the mayor?" "Why, of course." "And you had your photograph in the sketch? The Tattler, the Bystander, and the Sporting and Dramatic, all in the same week?" The girl nodded happily. "Yes, I'm Marie Huguenot," she said. "And I'm Jack Summers. So now we know each other." He took her hand. "Marie," he said, "ever since I have mended your bicycle, ever since I have known you, I have loved you. Will you marry me?" "Jack," she cooed. "You did say Jack, didn't you?" "Bless you, Marie. We shall be very poor, dear. Will you mind?" "Not with you, Jack. At least, not if you mean what I mean by very poor." "2,000 a year." "Yes, that's about what I mean." Jack took her in his arms. "And Mary Huggins can go and marry the Pope," he said with a smile. With a look of alarm in her eyes, she pushed him suddenly away from her. There was a crash as his foot went through the front wheel of the bicycle. "Mary Huggins?" she cried. "Yes. I was left a fortune on condition that I married a person called Mary Huggins. Absurd. As though—" "How much?" "Oh, quite a lot, if it wasn't for those confounded death duties. £5,000,000. You see—" "Jack! Jack!" cried the girl. "Don't you understand? I am Mary Huggins." He looked at her in amazement. "You said your name was Marie Huguenot," he said slowly. "My stage name, dear. Naturally, I couldn't. One mustn't. You know how particular managers are. When father died and I had to go on the stage for a living—" "Marie, my darling!" Mary rose and picked up her bicycle. The air had gone out of the back wheel again, and there were 4 spokes broken, but she did not heed it. "You must write to your lawyer to-night," she said. "Won't he be surprised?" But, being a great reader of the magazines, he wasn't. The Statesman. On a certain night in the middle of the season, all London was gathered in Lady Marchpane's drawing-room. All London, that is, which was worth knowing, a qualification which accounted for the absence of several million people who had never heard of Lady Marchpane. In one corner of the room an ambassador, with a few ribbons across his chest, could have been seen chatting to the latest American Duchess. In another corner, one of our largest advertisers was exchanging epigrams with a titled newspaper proprietor. Famous generals rubbed shoulders with post-impressionist artists. Financiers whispered sweet nothings to breeders of prize palms. Even an actor-manager might have been seen accepting an apology from a royalty who had just jostled him. "Hallo," said Algy Lascelles, catching sight of the dignified figure of Rupert Meryton in the crowd. "How's William?" A rare smile lit up Rupert's distinguished features. He was Under-Secretary for Invasion Affairs, and William was Algy's pleasant way of referring to the Bill which he was now piloting through the House of Commons. It was a measure for doing something or other by means of a what-do-you-call-it. I cannot be more precise without precipitating a European conflict. "I think we shall get it through," said Rupert calmly. "Lady Marchpane was talking about it just now. She's rather interested, you know." Rupert's lips closed about his mouth in a firm line. He looked over Algy's head into the crowd. "Oh," he said coldly. It was barely 10 years ago that young Meryton, just down from Oxford, had startled the political world by capturing the important seat of Cricklewood East for the Tariffadicals, as, to avoid plunging the country into civil war, I must call them. This was at a by-election, and the Liberatives had immediately dissolved, only to come into power after the general election with an increased majority. Through the years that followed, Rupert Meryton, by his pertinacity in asking the Invasion Secretary questions which had been answered by him on the previous day, and by his regard for the dignity of the House, as shown in his invariable comment Come, come, not quite the gentleman, upon any display of bad manners opposite, established a clear right to a post in the subsequent tariffatical government. He had now been Under-Secretary for 2 years, and in this bill his first real chance had come. "Oh, there you are, Mr. Meryton," said a voice. "Come and talk to me a moment." With a nod to a couple of archbishops, Lady Marchpane led the way to a little gallery whither the crowd had not penetrated. Priceless Correggios, Tintorettos, and G.K. Chestertons hung upon the walls, but it was not to show him these that she had come. Dropping into a wonderful old Chippendale chair, she motioned him to a Blundell maple opposite her, and looked at him with a curious smile. "Well," she said, "about the bill?" Rupert's lips closed about his mouth in a firm line. He was rather good at this. Folding his arms, he gazed steadily into Lady Marchpane's still beautiful eyes. "It will go through," he said, "through all its stages," he added professionally. "It must not go through," said Lady Marchpane gently. Rupert could not repress a start, but he was master of himself again in a moment. "I cannot add anything to my previous statement," he said. "If it goes through," began Lady Marchpane. "I must refer you," said Rupert, "to my answer of yesterday." "Come, come, Mr. Meryton, what is the good of fencing with me? You know the position. Or shall I state it for you again?" "I cannot believe you are serious." "I am perfectly serious. There are reasons, financial reasons, and others, why I do not want this bill to pass. In return for my silence upon a certain matter, you are going to prevent it passing. You know to what I refer. On the 4th of May last—" "Stop!" cried Rupert hoarsely. "On the 4th of May last," Lady Marchpane went on relentlessly, "you and I, in the absence of my husband abroad, had tea together at an A.B.C." Rupert covered his face with his hands. "I am no fonder of scandal than you are, but if you do not meet my wishes, I shall certainly confess the truth to Marchpane." "You will be ruined too," said Rupert. "My husband will forgive me and take me back." She paused significantly. "Will Marjorie Hale—" Rupert covered his hands with his face. "Will the good Miss Hale forgive you? She is very strict, is she not? And rich? And rising young politicians want money more than scandal." She raised her head suddenly at the sound of footsteps. "Ah, Archbishop, I was just calling Mr. Meryton's attention to this wonderful She looked at it more closely. "This wonderful Dana Gibson. A beautiful piece of work, is it not?" The intruders passed on to the supper-room, and they were again alone. "What am I to do?" said Rupert sullenly. "The fate of the bill is settled to-day week, when you make your big speech. You must speak against it. Confess frankly you were mistaken. It will be a close thing anyhow. Your influence will turn the scale." "It will ruin me politically." "You will marry Marjorie Hale and be rich. No rich man is ever ruined politically or socially." She patted his hand gently. "You'll do it?" He got up slowly. "You'll see next week," he said. It is not meet that we should watch the unhappy Rupert through the long-drawn hours of the night, as he wrestled with the terrible problem. A moment's sudden madness on that May afternoon had brought him to the crossroads. On the one hand, reputation, wealth, the girl that he loved. On the other, his own honour, and, so at least he had said several times on the platform, the safety of England. He rose in the morning weary, but with his mind made up. The bill should go through. Rupert Meryton was a speaker of a not unusual type. Although he provided the opinions himself, He always depended upon his secretary for the arguments with which to support them, and the actual words in which to give them being. But on this occasion he felt that a special effort was required of him. He would show Lady Marchpane that the blackmail of yesterday had only roused him to a still greater effort on behalf of his country. He would write his own speech. On the fateful night the house was crowded. It seemed that all the guests at Lady Marchpane's a week before were in the Distinguished Strangers' Gallery or behind the Ladies' Grill. From the Press Gallery, our special word painter looked down upon the statesmen beneath him, his eagle eye ready to detect on the moment the angry flush, the wince, or the sudden paling of enemy, the grim smile, or the lofty calm of friend. The Right Honourable Rupert Meryton, tariffadical member for Cricklewood East, rose to his feet amidst cheers. "Mr. Speaker," he said, "I rise, to-night, sir, to, so much of his speech I may give, but urgent state reasons compel me to withhold the rest. Were it ever known with which bill the secret history that I have disclosed concerns itself, the great powers in an instant would be at each other's throats. But though I may not disclose the speech, I can tell of its effect on the House. And its effect was curious. In fact, it was exactly the opposite of what Rupert Meryton, that promising Under-Secretary, had intended. It was the first speech that he had ever prepared himself. Than Rupert there was no more dignified figure in the House of Commons. His honour was proof, as we have seen, against the most insidious temptations. Yet, since one man cannot have all the virtues, he was distinctly stupid. It would have been a hopeless speech anyhow, but, to make matters worse, he had, in the most important part of it, attempted irony, and at the beginning of the ironical passage even the tariffadical word painters had to confess that it was their own stalwarts who suddenly paled. As Lady Marchpane had said, it was bound to be a close thing. The Liberatives and the Unialists, of course, were solid against the bill, but there was also something of a cave in the tariffadical party. It was bound to be a close thing, and Rupert's speech just made the difference. When he sat down, the waverers and doubters had made up their minds. The bill was defeated. That the tariffadical should resign was natural. Perhaps it was equally natural that Rupert's secretary should resign too. He said that his reputation would be gone if Rupert made any more speeches on his own, and that he wasn't going to risk it. Without his secretary, Rupert was lost at the general election which followed. Fortunately, he had a grateful friend in Lady Marchpane. She exerted her influence with the Liberatives, and got him an appointment as governor of the Stickjaw Islands. Here, with his beautiful and rich wife, Sir Rupert Meryton maintains a regal state, and upon his name no breath of scandal rests. Indeed, his only trouble so far has been with the Stickjaw language, a difficult language, but one which, perhaps fortunately, does not lend itself to irony. The Magnate. It was in October 19 that the word zinc first began to be heard in financial circles. City men, pushing their dominoes regretfully away, and murmuring zinc in apologetic tones, were back in their offices by 3 o'clock, forgetting in their haste to leave the usual twopence under the cup for the waitress. Clubmen, glancing at the tape on their way to the smoking-room, said to their neighbours, "Zinc's moved a point, I see," before covering themselves up with the Times. In the trains, returning husbands asked each other loudly, "What's all this about zinc?" All save the very innocent ones, who whispered, "I say, What is zinc exactly? The music halls took it up. No sooner had the word zinc left the lips of an acknowledged comedian than the house was in roars of laughter. The furore at the collodium when Octavius Octo, in his world-famous part of the landlady of a boarding-house, remarked, "I know why me old man's so late. He's busy buying zinc," is still remembered in the bars round Piccadilly. To explain it properly, it will be necessary, my readers will be alarmed to hear, to go back some 30 years. This, as a simple calculation shows, takes us to June 18 blank. It was in June 18 blank that Felix Moses, a stout young man of attractive appearance, if you care for that style, took his courage in both hands and told Phillida Sloane that he was worth 10,000 a year and was changing his name to Mountenay. Miss Sloane, seeing that it was the beginning of a proposal, said hastily that she was changing hers to Abraham. "You're marrying Leo Abraham?" asked Felix in amazement. "Ah!" A gust of jealousy swept over him. He licked his lips. There was a dangerous look in his eyes, a look that was destined in after days to make emperors and rival financiers quail. "Ah," he said softly, "Leo Abraham, I shall not forget." And now it will be necessary, my readers will be relieved to learn, to jump forward some 30 years. This obviously takes us up to September 19 blank. Let us, on this fine September morning, take a peep into number blank Throgneedle Street, E.C., and see how the business of the mother city is carried on. On the 4th floor, we come to the sanctum of the great man himself. Mr. Felix Mountenay, no admittance, is painted upon the outer door. It is a name which is known and feared all over Europe. Mr. Mountenay's private detective stands on one side of the door. On the other side is Mr. Mountenay's private wolf-hound. Murmuring the word "press," however, we pass hastily through and find ourselves before Mr. Mountenay himself. Mr. Mountenay is at work. Let us watch him through a typical 5 minutes. For a moment he stands meditating in the middle of the room. Kings are tottering on their thrones. Empires hang upon his nod. What will he decide? Suddenly he blows a cloud of smoke from his cigar and rushes to the telephone. "Hello, is that you, Jones? What are margarine prefs at? What? No, margarine prefs, idiot. Ah, then sell. Keep on selling till I tell you to stop. Yes." He hangs up the receiver. For 2 minutes he paces the room, smoking rapidly. He stops a moment, but it is only to remove his cigar band, which is in danger of burning. Then he resumes his pacings. Another minute goes rapidly by. He rushes to the telephone again. "Hello, is that you, Jones? What are margarine prefs down to now? Ah, then buy. Keep on buying. Yes." He hangs up the receiver. By this masterstroke he has made 250,000. It may seem to you or me an easy way of doing it. But what, we must ask ourselves, of the great brain that conceived the idea, the foresight which told the exact moment when to put it into action, the cool courage which seized the moment? What of the grasp of affairs, the knowledge of men? Can we grudge it him that he earns 250,000 more quickly than we do? Yet Mr. Felix Mountenay is not happy. When we have brought off a coup for 100,000 even, we smile gaily. Mr. Mountenay did not smile. Fiercely he bit another inch off his cigar and muttered to himself. The words were, "Leo Abraham, wait." That was positively the last row of dots. Let us take advantage of them to jump forward another month. It was October 1st, 19 . If that was a Sunday, then it was October 2nd. Anyhow, it was October. Mr. Felix Mountenay was sleeping in his office. For once that iron brain relaxed. He had made a little over $3 million in the last month, and the strain was too much for him. But a knock at the door restored him instantly to his own cool self. "I beg your pardon, sir," said his secretary, "but somebody is selling zinc." The word zinc touched a chord in Mr. Mountenay's brain which had lain dormant for years. Zinc. Why did zinc remind him of Leo Abraham? "Fetch the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Quick!" he cried. The secretary, a man of Herculean build, returned with some of it. With the luck which proverbially attends rich men, Mr. Mountenay picked up the Z volume at once. As he read the zinc article, it all came back to him. Leo Abraham had owned an empty zinc mine. Was his enemy in his clutches at last? "Buy," he said briefly. In a fortnight the secretary had returned. "Well," said Mr. Mountenay, "have you bought all the zinc there is?" "Yes, sir," said the secretary, "and a lot that there isn't," he added. "Good." He paused a moment. "When Mr. Leo Abraham calls," he added grimly, "show him up at once." It was a month later that a haggard man climbed the stairs of No. Throgneedle Street and was shown into Mr. Mountenay's room. "Well," said the financier softly, "what can I do for you?" "I want some zinc," said Leo Abergavenny. "Zinc," said Mr. Mountenay with a smile, "is £1,000,000 a ton. Or an acre, or a gallon, or however you prefer to buy it," he added humorously. Leo went white. "You wish to ruin me?" "I do. A promise I made to your wife some years ago." "My wife?" cried Leo. "What do you mean? I'm not married." It was Mr. Mountenay's turn to go white. He went it. "Not married? But Miss Sloane—" Mr. Leo Abergavenny sat down and mopped his face. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I asked Miss Sloane to marry me, and told her I was changing my name to Abergavenny, and she said that she thought she was changing hers to Moses. I thought—" "Stop!" cried Mr. Mountenay. He sat down heavily. Something seemed to have gone out of his life. In a moment the world was empty. He looked up at his old rival and forced a laugh. "Well, well," he said, "she deceived us both. Let us drink to our lucky escape." He rang the bell. "And then," he said in a purring voice, "we can have a little talk about zinc. After all, business is still business." End of section 15. Section 16 of Once a Week by A. Milne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, The Men Who Succeed, Part 2. The Doctor. His slippered feet stretched out luxuriously to the fire, Dr. Venables of Mudford lay back in his armchair and gave himself up to the delights of his Flor di Caballo, No. 2, a box of which had been presented to him by an apparently grateful patient. It had been a busy day. He had prescribed more than half a dozen hot milk puddings and a dozen changes of air. He had promised a score of times to look in again to-morrow, and the widow Nixie had told him yet again, but at greater length than before, her private opinion of doctors. Sometimes Gordon Venables wondered whether it was only for this that he had been the most notable student of his year at St. Bartholomew's. His brilliance, indeed, had caused something of a sensation in medical circles, and a remarkable career had been prophesied for him. It was Venables who had broken up one suffrage meeting after another by throwing white mice at the women on the platform, who day after day had paraded London dressed in the costume of a brown dog until arrested for biting an anti-vivisector in the leg. No wonder that all the prizes of the profession were announced to be within his grasp, and that when he buried himself in the little country town of Mudford, he was thought to have thrown away recklessly opportunities such as were granted to few. He had been in Mudford for 5 years now. An occasional paper in the Lancet on the recurrence of anthrophyllomelitis in earthworms kept him in touch with modern medical thought. But he could not help feeling that to some extent his powers were rusting in Mudford. As the years went on, his chance of Harley Street dwindled. "Come in," he said in answer to a knock at the door. The housekeeper's head appeared. "There's been an accident, sir," she gasped. "Gentleman run over." He snatched up his stethoscope and, without even waiting to inquire where the accident was, hurried into the night. Something whispered to him that his chance had come. After a quarter of an hour, he stopped a small boy. "Hello, Johnny," he said breathlessly. "Where's the accident?" The boy looked at him with open mouth for some moments. Then he had an idea. "Why, it's the doctor," he said. Dr. Venables pushed him over and ran on. It was in the High Street that the accident had happened. Lord Lair, an eccentric old gentleman who had sometimes walked when he might have driven, had, while dodging a motor car, been run into by a child's hoop. He lay now on the pavement, surrounded by a large and interested crowd. "Look out!" shouted somebody from the outskirts. "Here comes Doctor." Dr. Venables pushed his way through to his patient. His long search for the scene of the accident had exhausted him bodily, but his mind was as clear as ever. "Stand back there," he said in an authoritative voice. Then, taking out his stethoscope, he made a rapid examination of his patient. "Incised wound in the tibia," he murmured to himself. "Slight abrasion of the patella and contusion of the left ankle. The injuries are serious, but not necessarily mortal. Who is he?" The butcher, who had been sitting on the head of the fallen man, got up and disclosed the features of Lord Lair. Dr. Venables staggered back. "His lordship!" he cried. "He is a patient of Dr. Scott's. I have attended the client of another practitioner. Professionally, I am ruined." Lord Lair, who was now breathing more easily, opened his eyes. "Take me home," he groaned. Dr. Venables' situation was a terrible one. Medical etiquette demanded his immediate retirement from the case, but the promptings of humanity and the thought of his client's important position in the world were too strong for him. Throwing his scruples to the winds, he assisted the aged peer onto a hastily improvised stretcher and accompanied him to the hall. His lordship once in bed, the doctor examined him again. It was obvious immediately that there was only one hope of saving the patient's life. An injection of anthrophyllomelitis must be given without loss of time. Dr. Venables took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. He never travelled without a small bottle of this serum in his waistcoat pocket, a serum which, as my readers know, is prepared from the earthworm, in whose body, fortunately, large deposits of anthrophyllomelitis are continually found. With help from a footman in holding down the patient, the injection was made. In less than a year, Lord Lair was restored to health. Dr. Gordon Venables' case came before the British Medical Council early in October. The counts in his indictment were two. The first was that, on the 17th of June last, Dr. Gordon Venables did feloniously and with malice aforethought commit the disgusting and infamous crime of attending professionally the client of another practitioner. The second was that, in the course of rendering professional services to the said client, Dr. Venables did knowingly and wittingly employ the assistance of one who was not a properly registered medical man, to wit, Thomas Boiling, footman, thereby showing himself to be a scurvy fellow of infamous morals. Dr. Venables decided to apologise. He also decided to send in an account to Lord Lair for 250 guineas. He justified this to himself mainly on the ground that, according to a letter in that week's Lancet, the supply of anthrophyllomelitis in earthworms was suddenly giving out, and that it was necessary to recoup himself for the generous quantity he had injected into Lord Lair. Naturally, also, he felt that his lordship, as the author of the whole trouble, owed him something. The council, in consideration of his apology, dismissed the first count. On the second count, however, they struck him off the register. It was a terrible position for a young doctor to be in, but Gordon Venables faced it like a man. With Lord Lair's fee in his pocket, he came to town and took a house in Harley Street. When he had paid the first quarter's rent and the first instalment on the hired furniture, he had £50 left. £10 he spent on embossed stationery. £40 he spent on postage stamps. For the next 3 months, no journal was complete without a letter from 999 Harley Street, signed Gordon Venables, in which the iniquity of his treatment by the British Medical Council was dwelt upon with the fervour of a man who knew his subject thoroughly. No such letter was complete without a side reference to anthrophyllomelitis, as found, happily, in earthworms, and the anthrophyllomelitis treatment, as recommended by peers. 6 months previously, the name of Venables had been utterly unknown to the man in the street. In 3 months' time, it was better known even than Blank's, the well-known blank. One half of London said he was an infamous quack. The other half of London said he was a martyred genius. Both halves agreed that, after all, one might as well try this new what-you-may-call-it treatment, just to see if there was anything in it, don't you know? It was only last week that Mr. Venables made an excellent speech against the super-tax. The newspaper proprietor. The great Hector Strong, lord of journalism and swayer of empires, paced the floor of his luxurious apartment with bowed head, his corrugated countenance furrowed with lines of anxiety. He had just returned from a lunch with all his favourite advertisers, but it was not this which troubled him. He was thinking out a new policy for the Daily Vane. Suddenly he remembered something. Coming up to town in his third motor, he had glanced through the 19 periodicals which his house had published that morning, and in one case had noted matter for serious criticism. This was obviously the first business he must deal with. He seated himself at his desk and pushed the bell marked 38. Instantly a footman presented himself with a tray of sandwiches. "What do you want?" said Strong coldly. "You rang for me, sir," replied the trembling menial. "Go away," said Strong. Recognizing magnanimously, however, that the mistake was his own, he pressed bell 28. In another moment the editor of Sloppy Chunks was before him. "In today's number," said Strong, as he toyed with a blue pencil, "you apologized for a mistake in last week's number." He waited sternly. "It was a very bad mistake, sir, I'm afraid. We did a great injustice to—" "You know my rule," said Strong. "The mistake of last week I could have overlooked. The apology of this week is a more serious matter. You will ask for a month's salary on your way out." He pressed a button, and the editor disappeared through the trapdoor. Alone again, Hector Strong thought keenly for a moment. Then he pressed bell 38. Instantly a footman presented himself with a tray of sandwiches. "What do you mean by this?" roared Strong, his iron self-control for a moment giving way. "I beg your pardon, sir," stammered the man. "I thought—" "Get out!" As the footman retired, Strong passed his hand over his forehead. "My memory is bad to-day," he murmured, and pushed bell 48. A tall, thin man entered. "Ah, good afternoon, Mr. Brownlow," said the proprietor. He toyed with his blue pencil. "Let me see, which of our papers are under your charge at the moment?" Mr. Brownlow reflected. "Just now," he said, "I am editing Snippety Snips, The Whoop, The Girl's Own Aunt, Pairings, Slosh, The Sunday Sermon, and Backchat." "Ah, well, I want you to take on Sloppy Chunks too for a little while. Mr. Sims has had to leave us." "Yes, sir." Mr. Brownlow bowed and moved to the door. "By the way," Strong said, "your last number of Slosh was very good indeed. I congratulate you. Good day." Left alone, Hector Strong, lord of journalism and swayer of empires, resumed his pacings. His 2 mistakes with the bell told him that he was distinctly not himself this afternoon. Was it only the need of a new policy for the Vane which troubled him? Or could it be Lady Dorothy? Lady Dorothy Neale was something of an enigma to Hector Strong. He was making more than £1,000,000 a year, and yet she did not want to marry him. Sometimes he wondered if the woman were quite sane. Yet, mad or sane, he loved her. A secretary knocked and entered. He waited submissively for half an hour, until the proprietor looked up. "Well?" "Lady Dorothy Neale would like to see you for a moment, sir." "Show her in." Lady Dorothy came in brightly. "What nice-looking men you have here," she said. "Who is the one in the blue waistcoat? He has curly hair." "You didn't come to talk about him," said Hector reproachfully. "I didn't come to talk to him, really. But if you keep me waiting half an hour— Why, what are you doing?" Strong looked up from the note he was writing. The tender lines had gone from his face, and he had become the stern man of action again. "I am giving instructions that the services of my commissionaire, hall boy, and 5th secretary will no longer be required." "Don't do that," pleaded Dorothy. Strong tore up the note and turned to her. "What do you want of me?" he asked. She blushed and looked down. I have written a play," she faltered. He smiled indulgently. He did not write plays himself, but he knew that other people did. "When does it come off?" he asked. "The manager says it will have to at the end of the week. It came on a week ago." "Well," he smiled, "if people don't want to go, I can't make them." "Yes, you can," she said boldly. He gave a start. His brain, working at lightning speed, saw the possibilities in an instant. At one stroke he could win Lady Dorothy's gratitude, provide the Daily Vane with a temporary policy, and give a convincing exhibition of the power of his press. "Oh, Mr. Strong!" "Hector!" he whispered. As he rose from his desk to go to her, he accidentally pressed the button of the trapdoor. The next moment he was alone. That the British public is always ready to welcome the advent of a clean and wholesome home-grown play is shown by the startling success of Christina's Mistake, which is attracting such crowds to the King's every night. So wrote the Daily Vane, and continued in the same strain for a column. "Clubland is keenly exercised," wrote the Evening Vane, "over a problem of etiquette which arises in the second act of Christina's Mistake, the great autumn success at the King's Theatre. The point is, shortly, this: should a woman... and so on. "A pretty little story is going the rounds," said Slosh. "Anent that charming little lady, Estelle Rito, who plays the part of a governess in Christina's Mistake, for which, Manager Barodo informs me, advance booking up to Christmas has already been taken. It seems that Miss Rito, when shopping in the purlieus of Bond Street..." Sloppy Chunks had a joke which set all the world laughing. It was called Between the Acts. Flossie: "Who's the lady in the box with Mr. Johnson?" Gussie: "Hush, it's his wife." And Flossie giggled so much that she could hardly listen to the last act of Christina's Mistake, which she had been looking forward to for weeks. The Sunday sermon offered free tickets to 100 unmarried suburban girls, to which class Christina's Mistake might be supposed to make a special religious appeal. But they had to collect coupons first for the Sunday sermon. And finally, the Times, of 2 months later, said, "A marriage has been arranged between Lady Dorothy Neale, daughter of the Earl of Skye, and the Honourable Geoffrey Bollinger." Than a successful revenge, nothing is sweeter in life. Hector Strong was not the man to spare anyone who had done him an injury. Yet I think his method of revenging himself upon Lady Dorothy savoured of the diabolical. He printed a photograph of her in the Daily Picture Gallery. It was headed, "The Beautiful Lady Dorothy Neale." The Collector. When Peter Plimsoll, the Glue King, died, his parting advice to his sons to stick to the business was followed only by John, the elder. Adrian, the younger, had a soul above adhesion. He disposed of his share in the concern and settled down to follow the life of a gentleman of taste and culture and, more particularly, patron of the arts. He began in a modest way to collect ink-pots. His range at first was catholic, and it was not until he had acquired 147 ink-pots of various designs that he decided to make a specialty of historic ones. This decision was hastened by the discovery that one of Queen Elizabeth's inkstands, supposed by the owner to be the identical one with whose aid she wrote her last letter to Raleigh, was about to be put on the market. At some expense, Adrian obtained an introduction, through a third party, to the owner. At more expense, the owner obtained, through the same gentleman, an introduction to Adrian. And in less than a month the great Elizabeth ink-pot was safely established in Adrian's house. It was the beginning of the Plimsoll collection. This was 20 years ago. Let us to-day take a walk through the galleries of Mr. Adrian Plimsoll's charming residence, which, as the world knows, overlooks the park. Any friend of mine is always welcome at number 15. We will start with the North Gallery. I fear that I shall only have time to point out a few of the choicest gems. This is a Ponteciciori sword of the 3rd century, the only example of the master's art without any notches. On the left is a Capricci comfit box. If you have never heard of Capricci, you oughtn't to come to a house like this. Here we have before us the historic de Montigny topaz. Ask your little boy to tell you about it. In the East Gallery, of course, the chief treasure is the Santo di Santo amulet, described so minutely in his Vindicae Veritatis by John of Flanders. The original manuscript of this book is in the South Gallery. You must glance at it when we get there. It will save you the trouble of ordering a copy from your library. They would be sure to keep you waiting. With some such words as these, I led my friends round number 15. The many treasures in the private parts of the house I may not show, of course. The bathroom, for instance, in which hangs the finest collection of portraits of philatelists that Europe can boast. You must spend a night with Adrian to be admitted to their company. And as one of the elect, I can assure you that nothing can be more stimulating on a winter's morning than to catch the eye of Frisbee Dranger, F.Ph.S., behind the taps, as your head first emerges from the icy waters. Adrian Plimsoll sat at breakfast, sipping his hot water and crumbling a dry biscuit. A light was in his eye, a flush upon his pallid countenance. He had just heard from a trusty agent that the Scutori breastplate had been seen in Devonshire. His car was ready to take him to the station. But, alas, a disappointment awaited him. On close examination, the breastplate turned out to be a common Risoldo of inferior working. Adrian left the house in disgust, and started on his 7-mile walk back to the station. To complete his misery, a sudden storm came on. Cursing alternately his agent and Risoldo, he made his way to a cottage and asked for shelter. An old woman greeted him civilly and bade him come in. "If I may just wait till the storm is over," said Adrian, and he sat down in her parlour and looked appraisingly, as was his habit, round the room. The grandfather clock in the corner was genuine, but he was beyond grandfather clocks. There was nothing else of any value. 3 china dogs, and some odd trinkets on the chimney-piece, a print or two. Stay, what was that behind the youngest dog? "May I look at that old bracelet?" he asked, his voice trembling a little, and without waiting for permission he walked over and took up the circle of tarnished metal in his hands. As he examined it, his colour came and went. His heart seemed to stop beating. With a tremendous effort he composed himself and returned to his chair. It was the Emperor's bracelet. Of course you know the history of this most famous of all bracelets. Made by Spurius Quintus of Rome in 47 B.C., it was given by Caesar to Cleopatra, who tried without success to dissolve it in vinegar. Returning to Rome by way of Antony, it was worn at a minor conflagration by Nero, after which it was lost sight of for many centuries. It was eventually heard of during the reign of Canute, or Knut, as his admirers called him, and John is known to have lost it in the Wash, whence it was recovered a century afterwards. It must have travelled thence to France, for it was seen once in the possession of Louis XI, and from there to Spain, for Philip the Handsome presented it to Joanna on her wedding day. Columbus took it to America, but fortunately brought it back again. Peter the Great threw it at an indifferent musician. On one of its later visits to England, Pope wrote a couplet to it. And the most astonishing thing in its whole history was that now, for more than 100 years, it had vanished completely, to turn up again in a little Devonshire cottage. Verily, truth is stranger than fiction. "That's rather a curious bracelet of yours," said Adrian casually. "My wife has one just like it, which she asked me to match. Is it an old friend, or would you care to sell it?" "My mother gave it to me," said the old woman, "and she had it from her. I don't know no further than that. I didn't mean to sell it, but—" "Quite right," said Adrian, "and, after all, I can easily get another one. But I won't say a bit of money wouldn't be useful. What would you think a fair price, sir? 5 shillings?" Adrian's heart jumped. To get the Emperor's bracelet for 5 shillings! But the spirit of the collector rose up strong within him. He laughed kindly. "My good woman," he said, "they turn out bracelets like that in Birmingham at 2 shillings apiece, and quite new. I'll give you 10 pence. Make it 1 and 6 pence, she pleaded. Times are hard. Adrian reflected. He was not, strictly speaking, impoverished. He could afford 1 and 6 pence. 1 and 2 pence, he said. No, no, 1 and 6 pence, she repeated obstinately. Adrian reflected again. After all, he could always sell it for £10,000 if the worst came to the worst. Well, well, he sighed. 1 and 6 pence let it be. He counted out the money carefully. Then, putting the precious bracelet in his pocket, he rose to go. Adrian has no relations living now. When he dies, he proposes to leave the Plimsoll collection to the nation, having, as far as he can foresee, no particular use for it in the next world. This is really very generous of him, and no doubt when the time comes the papers will say so. But it is a pity that he cannot be appreciated properly in his lifetime. Personally, I should like to see him knighted. The Adventurer. Lionel Norwood, from his earliest days, had been marked out for a life of crime. When quite a child, he was discovered by his nurse killing flies on the window-pane. This was before the character of the housefly had become a matter of common talk among scientists, and Lionel, like all great men, a little before his time, had pleaded hygiene in vain. He was smacked hastily and bundled off to a preparatory school, where his aptitude for smuggling sweets would have lost him many a half-holiday, had not his services been required at outside left in the hockey 11. With some difficulty he managed to pass into Eton, and 3 years later, with, one would imagine, still more difficulty, managed to get superannuated. At Cambridge he went downhill rapidly. He would think nothing of smoking a cigar in academical costume, and on at least one occasion he drove a dog-cart on Sunday. No wonder that he was requested, early in his second year, to give up his struggle with the little go and betake himself back to London. London is always glad to welcome such people as Lionel Norwood. In no other city is it so simple for a man of easy conscience to earn a living by his wits. If Lionel ever had any scruples, which, after a perusal of the above account of his early days, it may be permitted one to doubt, they were removed by an accident to his solicitor, who was run over in the Argentine on the very day that he arrived there with what was left of Lionel's money. Reduced suddenly to poverty, Norwood had no choice but to enter upon a life of crime. Except, perhaps, that he used slightly less hair oil than most, he seemed just the ordinary man about town, as he sat in his dressing-gown one fine summer morning and smoked a cigarette. His rooms were furnished quietly and in the best of taste. No signs of his nefarious profession showed themselves to the casual visitor. The appealing letters from the princess whom he was blackmailing, the wire apparatus which shot the 2 of spades down his sleeve during the coon-can nights at the club, the thimble and pea with which she had performed the 3-card trick so successfully at Epsom last week, all these were hidden away from the common gaze. It was a young gentleman of fashion who lounged in his chair and toyed with a priceless straight-cut. There was a tap at the door, and Masters, his confidential valet, came in. "Well," said Lionel, "have you looked through the post?" "Yes, sir," said that man. "There's the usual cheque from Her Highness, a request for more time from the lady in Tite Street with 2 pence to pay on the envelope, and banknotes from the Professor as expected. The young gentleman of Hill Street has gone abroad suddenly, sir." "Ah," said Lionel, with a sudden frown. "I suppose you'd better cross him off our list, Masters." "Yes, sir. I had ventured to do so, sir. I think that's all, except that Mr. Snooks is glad to accept your kind invitation to dinner and bridge to-night. Will you wear the hair-spring coat, sir, or the metal clip?" Lionel made no answer. He sat plunged in thought. When he spoke, it was about another matter. "Masters," he said, "I have found out Lord Fairlie's secret at last. I shall go to see him this afternoon." "Yes, sir. Will you wear your revolver, sir, as it's a first call?" "I think so. If this comes off, Masters, it will make our fortune." "I hope so, I'm sure, sir." Masters placed the whisky within reach and left the room silently. Alone, Lionel picked up his paper and turned to the agony column. As everybody knows, the agony column of a daily paper is not actually so domestic as it seems. When Mother apparently says to Floss, "Come at home once, father gone away for week, Bert and Sid longing to see you," what is really happening is that Barney Hoker is telling Judd Batson to meet him outside the Duke of Westminster's little place at 3 a.m. precisely on Tuesday morning, not forgetting to bring his jemmy and a dark lantern with him. And Floss's announcement next day, "Coming home with George," is Judd's way of saying that he will turn up all right, and half thinks of bringing his automatic pistol with him too, in case of accidents. In this language, which of course takes some little learning, Lionel Norwood had long been an expert. The advertisement which he was now reading was unusually elaborate. "Lost, in a taxi between Baker Street and Shepherd's Bush, a gold-mounted umbrella with initials J.P. on it. If Ellen will return to her father immediately, all will be forgiven. White spot on foreleg. Mother very anxious and desires to return thanks for kind enquiries. Answers to the name of Ponto. Bis dat qui cito dat." What did it mean? For Lionel, it had no secrets. He was reading the revelation by one of his agents of the skeleton in Lord Fairlie's cupboard. Lord Fairlie was one of the most distinguished members of the Cabinet. His vein of high seriousness, his lofty demeanour, the sincerity of his manner endeared him not only to his party, but even, astounding as it may seem, to a few high-minded men upon the other side, who admitted, in moments of expansion which they probably regretted afterwards, that he might, after all, be as devoted to his country as they were. For years now his life had been without blemish. It was impossible to believe that even in his youth he could have sown any wild oats. Terrible to think that these wild oats might now be coming home to roost. "What do you require of me?" he said courteously to Lionel, as the latter was shown into his study. Lionel went to the point at once. "I am here, my lord," he said, "on business. In the course of my ordinary avocations," the parliamentary atmosphere seemed to be affecting his language, "I ascertained a certain secret in your past life, which, if it were revealed, might conceivably have a not undamaging effect upon your career. For my silence in this matter, I must demand a sum of £50,000. Lord Fairlie had grown paler and paler as this speech proceeded. "What have you discovered?" he whispered. Alas, he knew only too well what the damning answer would be. 20 years ago," said Lionel, "you wrote a humorous book." Lord Fairlie gave a strangled cry. His keen mind recognised in a flash what a hold this knowledge would give his enemies. Shafts of Folly, his book had been called. Already he saw the leading articles of the future. We confess ourselves somewhat at a loss to know whether Lord Fairlie's speech at Plymouth yesterday was intended as a supplement to his earlier work, Shafts of Folly, or as a serious offering to a nation impatient of levity in such a crisis. The Cabinet's jester, in whom 20 years ago the country lost an excellent clown without gaining a statesman, was in great form last night. Lord Fairlie has amused us in the past with his clever little parodies. He may amuse us in the future, but as a statesman we can only view him with disgust." "Well," said Lionel at last, "I think your lordship is wise enough to understand. The discovery of a sense of humour in a man of your eminence—" But Lord Fairlie was already writing out the cheque. The Explorer. As the evening wore on, and one young man after another asked Jocelyn Montrevor if she were going to Ascot what, or to Henley what, or what, she wondered more and more if this were all that life would ever hold for her. Would she never meet a man, a real man, who had done something? These boys around her were very pleasant, she admitted to herself, very useful indeed, she added, as one approached her with some refreshments, but they were only boys. "Here you are," said Freddie, handing her an ice in 3 colours. "I've had it made specially cold for you. They only had the green, pink, and yellow jerseys left. I hope you don't mind. The green part is arsenic, I believe. If you don't want the wafer, I'll take it home and put it between the sashes of my bedroom window. The rattling kept me awake last night. That's why I'm looking so ill, by the way." Jocelyn smiled kindly and went on with her ice. "That reminds me," Freddie went on, "we've got a nut here to-night, the genuine thing. None of your Society Barcelonas or suburban Filberts. One of the real Cobb family. The driving from the 6th tee, inset on the right, and New Year's message to the country touch. In short, a celebrity." "Who?" asked Jocelyn eagerly. Perhaps here was a man. "Worrall Brice, the explorer. Don't say you haven't heard of him, or Aunt Alice will cry." Heard of him? Of course she had heard of him. Who hadn't? Worrall Brice's adventures in distant parts of the Empire would have filled a book, had, in fact, already filled 3. A glance at his flat in St. James's Street gave you some idea of the adventures he had been through. Here were the polished spurs of his companion in the famous ride through Australia from north to south, all that had been left by the cannibals of the Wagga Wagga River after their banquet. Here was the poisoned arrow which, by the merciful intervention of Providence, just missed Worrall and pierced the heart of one of his black attendants, the post-mortem happily revealing the presence of a new and interesting poison. Here, again, was the rope with which he was hanged by mistake as a spy in South America, a mistake which would certainly have had fatal results if he had not had the presence of mind to hold his breath during the performance. In yet another corner you might see his favourite mascot, a tooth of the shark which bit him off the coast of China. Spears, knives, and guns lined the walls. Every inch of the floor was covered by skins. His flat was typical of the man, a man who had done things. "Introduce him to me," commanded Jocelyn. "Where is he?" She looked up suddenly and saw him entering the ballroom. He was of commanding height, and his face was the face of a man who has been exposed to the forces of nature. The wind, the waves, the sun, the mosquito had set their mark upon him. Down one side of his cheek was a newly healed scar, a scratch from a hippopotamus in its last death struggle. A legacy from a bison seared his brow. He walked with the soft, easy tread of the python, or the pathan, or some animal with a th in it. Probably I mean the panther. He bore himself confidently, and his mouth was a trap from which no superfluous word ever escaped. He was the strong, silent man of Jocelyn's dreams. "Mr. Worrall Brice, Miss Montrevor," said Freddie, and left them. Worrall Brice bowed, and stood beside her with folded arms, his gaze fixed above her head. "I shall not expect you to dance," said Jocelyn, with a confidential smile, which implied that he and she were above such frivolities. As a matter of fact, he could have taught her the Wagga Wagga one-step, the Bimbo, the Ki-yi, the Jubu and the Head Hunter's Hug, and many other cannibalistic steps, which, later on, were to become the rage of London and the basis of a revue. "I have often imagined you, as you kept watch over your camp," she went on, "and I have seemed myself to hear the savages and lions roaring out of the circle of fire, what time in the swamps the crocodiles were barking." "Yes," he said. "It must be a wonderful life." "Yes." "If I were a man, I should want to lead such a life, to get away from all this," and she waved her hand round the room, "back to nature, to know that I could not eat until I had first killed my dinner, that I could not live unless I slew the enemy. That must be fine." "Yes," said Worrall. "I cannot get Freddy to see it. He is quite content to have shot a few grouse, and once to have wounded a beater. There must be more in life than that." "Yes." "I suppose I am elemental. Beneath the veneer of civilization I am a savage. To wake up with the war cry of the enemy in my ears, to sleep with the barking of the crocodile in my dreams, that is life." Worrall Brice tugged at his moustache and gazed into space over her head. Then he spoke. "Crocodiles don't bark," he said. Jocelyn looked at him in astonishment. "But in your book, Through Trackless Paths," she cried. "I know it almost by heart. It was you who taught me. What are the beautiful words? 'On the banks of the sleepy river two great crocodiles were barking.'" "Not barking," said Worrall. "Basking. It was a misprint." "Oh," said Jocelyn. She had a moment's awful memory of all the occasions when she had insisted that crocodiles barked. There had been a particularly fierce argument with Meta Richards, who had refused to weigh even the printed word of Worrall Brice against the silence of the Reptile House on her last visit to the Zoo. "Well," smiled Jocelyn, "you must teach me about these things. Will you come and see me?" "Yes," said Worrall. He rather liked to stand and gaze into the distance while pretty women talked to him, and Jocelyn was very pretty. "We live in South Kensington. Come on Sunday, won't you? 99 Peel Crescent." "Yes," said Worrall. On Sunday, Jocelyn waited eagerly for him in the drawing-room of Peel Crescent. Her father was asleep in the library, her mother was dead, so she would have the great man to herself for an afternoon. Later she would have him for always, for she meant to marry him. And when they were married, she was not so sure that they would live with the noise of the crocodile barking, or coughing, or whatever it did, in their ears. She saw herself in that little house in Green Street, with the noise of motor horns and taxi whistles to soothe her to sleep. Yet what a man he was! What had he said to her? She went over all his words. They were not many. At 6 o'clock she was still waiting in the drawing-room at Peel Crescent. At 6:30 Worrall Brice had got as far as Peel Place. At 6:45 he found himself in Radcliffe Square again. At 7 o'clock, just as he was giving himself up for lost, he met a taxi and returned to St. James's Street. He was a great traveller, but South Kensington had been too much for him. Next week he went back, unmarried, to the jungle. It was the narrowest escape he had had. End of section 16. Recording by Kirsten Wever. End of Once a Week by A. Milne.